Now, the bigger picture. I'm going to move to education now, and I'll then move to language education. And just a quote here, this is from something I wrote with John Gray a while back, and again looking at what the purpose of education is according to a kind of neoliberal agenda. Would be to service the economy through the production of human capital. This is not news to anybody in this room. In other words, education is reconstrued as ultimately being about the production of workers with the skills and dispositions necessary to compete in the global economy, and compete is a key word there. There's also marketization of education. Again, not new material here, but what does marketization actually mean? And we talk about practices involving the exchange of goods, resources according to norms of competitiveness and economic efficiency, somewhat repeating what I said before, fields of social activity, marketization, and you sort of go through this. And so this is kind of background. We're looking at education in neoliberal times being marketized, or being treated as a market, but it's actually very real. This is not just a metaphor, this is actually a reality. Okay, so, as I said, I'll look at three language teaching related phenomena, and you might well say, well, why those three and not others? Because there's only three I can talk about. So, again, the three I can talk about because I've actually published something related to them, right? And I thought I might bring that material in. So, the first one is about what language and how competence in particular language indexes social class and inequality. The second one, how language teaching materials have carrier content, and this carrier content is imbued with ideals and model citizenship and class. And then the last one is a bit of a stretch, but it's something I published with John Gray recently in, what journal? I can't remember the journal now, I'll get it later. But anyway, how teachers are subjected to work regimes. And I think this is a debatable one, because there's some parts of the world where teachers were being pushed down for a while, but maybe there's a shortage of teachers because nobody wanted to do the job, and perhaps salaries have gone up. But I'll be looking at some data from the UK that goes back actually to the year 2000, and you might ask why, but I'll explain why I'm looking at that particular period. Okay? So the idea of what language really takes us into the realm of language policy. And in the 2015 book that Tom Rosento, who's sitting, where's Tom? Tom's right there. Edited in 2015, he's got a very good introduction. I think that's the introduction. And a very nice quote here looking at the way in language, in LPP, language policy, and language planning and policy research, political economy gets a look in, but maybe people aren't really either informing themselves enough to apply more political economy, or the kind of understandings they have seem to be fairly superficial. And this is something that I would agree with. I cross applied in linguistics, in fact. Now, what language becomes a question? What language is being learned? I'm just going to flash up here a bunch of contexts. Of course, it's English. Everybody has to learn English. Everybody knows that. If you're living in Europe, for example, if you're living in East Asia, this is what always comes up. So I'll just very briefly touch on this. A lot of you will be familiar with this work, but there's a lot of, and if the country's not listed, it's because I've just kind of gone geographically. So I've got one example from East Asia, for example, and then I moved to Europe, et cetera, et cetera. So we have the idea of South Korea. South Korea is actually a very interesting country to look at English, because people like Joseph Park and other scholars actually produced quite a bit of material in recent years. And what you're seeing is the sort of English divide that develops, and who has money in South Korea, either to buy private tuition within the country, but then you have this phenomenon that people like Shin have looked at, where you have a wild geese family. So you have families in Toronto, and the kids are sent away from South Korea for some years to ostensibly to learn English. And again, who can afford to do that? People with money, so not everybody can. And so English comes to mediate the kind of class divide. It's not the cause of the class divide by any means. English itself can't really do anything. What is the agency of English? I think some research in the last 30 years is attributed to English, killer language. Well, I'm not sure how that works, but even though I agree with some of the ideas around the notion. But anyway, we have that going on. In Spanish education, Luisa Martín Roja has a very interesting study going back the first part of, I like this, the first part of the century. I never thought I'd say that in my lifetime, but around, what is the first part of the century called? The first 10 years, what do we call those? The tens? We don't have it. We weren't prepared for this century. We don't have a vocabulary to talk about it. Nobody knows. I was giving a talk the other day, and I said, what's this called? We're in now, the teens? I don't know what the term is.
How about post 9/11?
Yeah, post 9/11, that's another one. Okay. Anyway, sorry. This is an interesting study, and several researchers involved. There's still some things being published on it, but it looked at bilingual schools in Madrid. And so you had a lot of English medium instruction being brought in. And what came out of this was the kids were actually getting on the program, the kids who had to have a certain level of English, and those kids necessarily from middle-class families. So it might have been, you had in schools, you had kind of hierarchies developing, where the school was mixed in terms of class, and also in terms of recent arrivals from around the world, so the children of immigrants. You might have the immigrant kids who were like in some special classes for Spanish, and then you'd have the sort of working class kids who don't have enough level of English, and then the middle class kids getting into the programs. Right? And that's sort of ongoing, but again, it's another interesting example of the way English comes to mediate divisions in society. And of course, these divisions become broader, at least in terms of English. Right? So the people who know a little bit of English get much better. People who don't know enough English sort of stay where they are. But we can look in contexts such as India, and we see similar things going on. Great book in 2005 by Ramanathan, very vivid descriptions of different universities, one with sort of higher level of English, one with a lower level of English. And Ladusa's interesting recent book about India and the English language. English in Mexico, a very recent book by López Copar, and he's looking at, again, looking at the introduction of English, medium instruction in schools, and English in Africa. Several contexts looked at here. And again, very interestingly, similar sorts of issues coming out. So local elites manage to get their kids in the right schools to learn English, and other people don't. International schools in general. I was at a conference recently and came across, I forgot her first name, Ken Way. She's a sociologist from Australia, but she's involved in this international project looking at international schools. Not a language specialist, but fascinating stuff coming out of that. So international elites moving around the world, putting their kids in schools. And again, very, very interesting things going on there. And of course, Shirley Jenkins, the book she wrote in 2013, which was, had elements of ELF in it, but actually it was actually a pretty good book that was about English medium instruction and higher education in a lot of different contexts. Right? So all of these things, all of these phenomena, if you like, around the introduction of English, as I said, I just keep repeating the same thing, mark, that the common ground is that English doesn't cause the inequality, but it's actually, if we look in terms of vital, existential, and resource inequality, for example, it doesn't cause those things. But its presence as a preferred language emerges from larger economic realms. And I'm trying to read my own handwriting here, and I can't read it. But anyway, but when you actually look at, again, you're looking on the surface, you're looking at who speaks English and who doesn't, then you start seeing the class divisions coming through. And I would relate this, again, getting back to sort of political economy, we could relate this to work that's been done on the transnational global middle class. Now, Stephanie Van Dyck's done very interesting work looking at universities in the States and sort of elites, if you like, in these universities. This is much broader, if you like, looking at society in general. And you have people very high material capital, oriented to the self, individualization, oriented to transnational contacts. And so, again, I mentioned Robert Reich earlier talking about changes in the class system in the United States going back to the 80s. He had been talking about this sort of investment that people have, people with a lot of money. What investment do they have in the state, despite all the talk about being patriots and everything else? Actually, those are the first people to pull their money out of a country when things go bad. Right? So again, it's quite interesting. What is their stake in the nation because they're so far above it? And their peers are people like them in other countries. Okay? No secrets here, but again, interesting work going on. So they're sharing interests across the nation states, share modes of behavior, consumption patterns, and again, have the capacity to affect great control over events in their lives, and indeed the lives of others. Now, there are other language contexts besides English that, again, we can see inequality coming through, and somewhat surprisingly in some. I put French and Spanish immersion schools because what we've seen in research taking place over the last 10 or 15 years is what might have started, Deborah Palmer's study in is California and Texas, I can't remember, but looking at bilingual schools, Spanish-English bilingual schools set up ostensibly for people from very modest backgrounds. Right? And yet middle-class parents thinking, well, here's an opportunity for my kid to learn Spanish. And a very interesting article in 2009, it's got middle-class kids in the class who actually they know how to work the teacher, right? And so they actually get more attention than the other kids. And so you have this kind of, again, a class divide coming in here. The complementary school studies, quite a bit of that in the UK in the last 20 years, again raises class issues, although the authors involved in it haven't done that. But there is an issue of what parents, at some level, can be bothered to take their kids to classes on Saturdays, right, for a heritage language. And also, you probably need a certain wherewithal, you need to know certain things, but you also need to have, perhaps in some cases, not all, some level of income, or at least the luxury of not working on Saturday, right? So imagine both parents work on Saturday, they actually have to take the child's quite young, they maybe can't participate in this, right? So again, I think there are class issues here. I've seen some of this data because I work closely with some of the people around it, although I wasn't involved in the project at all. But I always thought about class issues here. So as Kendiger works, I mean, looking at surveys she's done, looking at more specific research she's done, again, class issues come out of this. Who actually is involved in student mobility? Very often people, what we're finding in Europe with Erasmus programs is they've cut so much that they only give partial funding. So if you're from a working class or poor background, they'll give you, 400 euros a month to live on, and you can go away for 6 months, but can you actually pay that? Whereas middle class parents might have the money and they can make up the difference, if you like. So again, economic crisis is exacerbating differences. It maybe didn't exist before, because there was more money before for Erasmus. And then there's niche elitism. German alert. Here's the second one, okay? Coming through. I'm trying, right? I'm trying, right? Okay. I thought this was interesting because when we look at what language, we had this sort of, it's almost like a flash in the pan in Spain. And who's at fault? Angela Merkel. It's always the same. She had to open her mouth. She had to open her mouth. And this is an article I got online. I think this newspaper was, you could get the version in English. Anyway, it's the version in English of the article, O País. And you see the demand for German lessons. It's from 2012, right? So again, when Merkel announced, sort of say, well, if you're engineers, come on, we'll take you. But you need to speak German. And that is a problem. So what happened was we had the number of students of German in Spain increases by 49% in 5 years. Right? Wow. Where was German going before that? Like that, so suddenly it goes up. However, you read that and you see, some statistics. I know a couple of people who work in what are called official language schools for adults in Spain, or across Spain. And there's a couple of people in Barcelona who are German teachers. And I asked them recently about this. Did this really take hold and is really noticeable? And they said, not really, not really. So I suspect what a lot of people found, quite surprisingly, is that you can't learn German in 1 year. Right? So they enrolled thinking, I'll do this accelerated course and I'll be speaking German and then I'll go to Germany and work as an engineer. So again, I think it's probably a flash in the pan. I don't know what will happen. But anyway, maybe the doors have closed by now, I don't know. But anyway, so that's